To start off with a refresher of what the Asian entrepreneur is broadly, and then we'll go into specifics. But yeah, do tell us.
Sure, it's wonderful to be back. It's been a few years, but essentially what the Asian Entrepreneur is we are a knowledge platform that seeks to gather and also to provide access to the collective knowledge of entrepreneurship in Asia. How we sort of depart from the conventional ways of doing this is that we focus on doing it through crowdsourcing. So we actively crowdsource the insights, the experiences, and the personal wisdom of people and individuals who are actually part and based in the region. And what we do is we invite the contribution on our platform, and in doing so we hope to provide people a more holistic view of doing business in the region.
You started out with involved in a startup in Hong Kong.
Yes.
Right? Tell me about that story.
It was horrible.
Okay. We love these horrible stories.
Yes, so
tell us.
I was relatively young at the time, as a young
Still
entrepreneur.
young. Okay.
Yes, thank you. And at the time I was presented what seemed like quite a lucrative and great opportunity to get into a venture in Hong Kong. At the time, it seemed like a good idea. I trusted the guy, and also the idea seemed sound. Furthermore, we did market research, and all of us being Asians, although not from Hong Kong, we assumed based on all that we could just get into it. But then after actually trying it, we realized that it's actually totally different, and within a year it failed terribly.
What were the lessons learned there?
Lessons learned is basically, I think a lot of us have this assumption that Asia is pretty much the same. We're all Asians, we assume that the markets are very similar, although they can be fundamentally different. For example, somewhere like Indonesia, which is relatively close by to Malaysia, not only in terms of proximity, in terms of culture, is actually a totally different market where different strategies apply, where different market dynamics apply. In
different parts of Indonesia.
As well, yes. Right. So I think the lesson learned there was that we don't actually know too much about Asia, despite what we think, despite the fact that we live in a globalized world. And not only that, one of the biggest lessons learned at the time was that we depended on resources to do research. But what I found out is that many of the resources that existed, especially from conventional means, are relatively detached from the scene in a sense where they provide more of a macro coverage that there are little practical relevance to really help. And what's really required is really sitting down perhaps with someone very experienced like yourself and really speaking to the person and learning the personal insights that way. And that is something that we've always been trying to do with our work.
Okay, and of course, then that didn't lead you to start the Asian Entrepreneur. But what led you to start the Asian Entrepreneur? That was it, to try to understand the psyche of entrepreneurs in Asia.
I think the catalyst was the sense of despair that I felt after I failed. Because it was truly despair. But I think one of the things I learned as well is that knowledge is really quite powerful. We seem to overlook that. We seem to think, no, it's funding, no, it's strategies, but really it's understanding. And it was really this sense of me wanting to prevent that for myself and for others that really led us to start the Asian Entrepreneur, really as an experiment to build better understanding so that we can empower people to be better entrepreneurs and hopefully advance entrepreneurship as well in Asia and the region.
Okay, so it started off with print.
Yes.
And then you pivoted to digital. Tell me that journey.
So we started off with print, and 7 years ago we were mainly printing and distributing in the East Coast of the United States. Because of financial constraints at the time, we had about 100,000 copies. Realistically, we reached less than maybe 50,000 people in maybe some cities. And in a way, it was not very effective in trying to achieve the mission that we had, which was really to educate more people and hopefully to create more insights and to gather more collective insights on the region. Financially, it would have been very hard to expand that with that model because obviously it would have been capital intensive and incredibly difficult to do so.
Do you think print magazines still work?
To be very frank with you, I think it's a dead industry, if not dying in many parts.
Right.
And I think that's because the shifts in technological advancements have really changed the entire landscape. And I don't think it's good to say that media is dead. Obviously media isn't. It's transformed entirely. It's become much more efficient in so many ways. So I think it's evolved A better word would be to say it's evolved
Right.
tremendously, yes. But I don't think print works anymore, especially in terms of most media.
Right.
It works in certain contexts, though, I think, certainly, but not for media.
Right. So and that's recognizing it. Was it a painful decision, moving from print to digital, or was it like, okay, we know this is the right thing to do?
It was a very painful decision because being a social enterprise, our mission is to try and create not only knowledge for Asia, but also accessibility to knowledge. Previously, the major way that we generated revenue was really through the sales of the magazines and also some advertising within the pages. But then since going to a digital route, especially a route that is modeled after Wikipedia, we pretty much cut off one of the main ways that we've made money. And that has been something that's been really difficult. We had to be really tenacious and creative in how we could scale despite cutting off one of our lifelines, really, essentially.
So we'll talk about how you turn revenues in just a moment as well. And so making that transition, how do you, when now you're going through this crowdsourcing model, how do you ensure that the information is accurate?
Right, and I think that's really been a challenge of crowdsourcing in general, especially crowdsourcing knowledge and content. I think, first of all, we need to define, at least for the crowdsourcer, what integrity is. For us, integrity pretty much means three things: that the content is not commercial, it's not frivolous, and it's also not, agenda-driven. And as long as they fit these criteria, generally we allow it because we want to try and welcome diversity as well as flexibility in our content. Now, in terms of actually realizing this, we do have an editorial framework. So the majority of the staff that we have on hand are moderators and editors, and you can see them more as brokers of knowledge. So we have all these content coming in like torrents, and then they basically sift through them to try and determine, obviously, that these negative criteria are not there. And if they're not, then we generally publish it. So it's not an exact science. Certainly there can be inaccuracies here and there, but we try our best to try and ensure integrity that way.
Okay, what is the negative criteria, for example?
For example, commercially driven content, person trying to self-promote, or
she's
obviously
amazing, she's wonderful.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I'm amazing, I'm wonderful, that sort of thing.
Yes. So, adverts in that sense, yeah.
Right. Okay, so I want to find out then how you started off in the US, right?
Yes.
Why did you start off in the US?
It just so happens at the time I was there, and so my co-founders, they were all there as well. So that's where we started naturally.
Right.
But very quickly, we moved to Asia, and hence I moved several years ago because obviously to really be part of the scene, we had to be here. And that move was also quite an eye-opening experience for me because I've spent most of my life abroad as well.
When you look at the Asian entrepreneur, are we, and you say we're different in different parts of Asia, but are we different from the West? Aren't they some certain things? Aren't there some things that are universal?
Right, certainly. I think some things are universal, but at the same time, the rate of development is different. The culture is different. I think, there's certainly a big difference right now where we're seeing that Asia is really now entrenched in entrepreneurship. I think at the moment we're seeing a startup boom, and at the same time, I even say we're seeing a sort of renaissance. There has been technological advancements as well as greater access to information that has really made entrepreneurship, has really allowed it to thrive here. So for example, right now, we see China and India really leading the boom with a lot of billion-dollar startups. But at the same time, Southeast Asia is also thriving with its startup ecosystems. So Singapore is obviously the one that's most heard of in front in terms of the arena. But other parts of Southeast Asia as well. And I think the difference really comes from the fact it's developing. For example, if you look at the primary markets, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, we're seeing markets that have roughly 600 million consumers. 300 million of them are internet users, and every month we're seeing roughly around 4 million more people going online as well. And so if we look at how it's different, it's of course quite different from the West in terms of its development rate, but it's also developing very quickly, and that presents different challenges. And what's interesting as well is, so different reports have also mentioned that we'll see more growth here as well. For example, it's predicted that the e-commerce economy for Southeast Asia is going to reach 88 billion by 2025. But at the same time, there are great differences. For example, culturally, it's also very different, which can actually affect entrepreneurship. For example, most Asian markets culturally, the entrepreneurs and the people there, they're also more risk averse and sort of afraid of failure. Whereas in the West, they wear it as a badge of honor. Institutional framework is also very different. The legal regulatory environment in Asia is largely uncertain. So it's a very Wild West place for many entrepreneurs that decide to come here. And also at the same time, aside from that as well, the markets themselves, the behavior, the preferences is also very different. Some ideas that you think would work in the West, they don't necessarily work here yet. A lot of people are trying to drive its adoption. So it's a growing market, and I would say growing much faster in terms of rate than in the West. But at the same time, it's also a challenging market, and I think that's the major difference between Asia and the West.
I'm just looking at the figures at the moment. So you have a presence in 20 other countries with active monthly readerships in 13, right? And you crowdsource a lot of your information. Where is the revenue money? Where's the money coming from?
Yes, this is the greatest challenge. So the challenge being that in order to fulfill our mission of creating greater accessibility to our work, we essentially had to forego many of the traditional methods of generating money. For example, we don't have a paywall. All the content is entirely free. We have basically forgone traditional advertising as well. There's no ads. And also the fact that we're now completely online and not selling physical copies, there's no revenue in that sense. So how have we gone about it is that we've actually tied ourselves up with some private equity companies in the West that are immensely interested in Asia, and they need basically a body and an advisor in sourcing deal opportunities and assessing the rate of growth as well for certain startups, and that's how we really generate the sort of revenue that we need.
Right. And what are people, what are these companies interested when they look at Asia? Are they looking at certain industries? Are they looking at certain individuals? What do you see happening?
I think it's quite diverse. I think it's quite diverse at the moment. We're seeing, in terms of a deal flow investments, we're seeing investments in all sorts of industries, even in tech, which is in the past really risky for these investors. So I don't think there's a particular industry. It's in everything really.
Right. And you're also working with governments in stimulating entrepreneurship. What are some things you've done?
So one thing that's been quite interesting for us in terms of progression has been that we've been recognized now by various bodies as a knowledge house in this area, as a specialist in this area. And we've been able to leverage our knowledge, our content, as well as our network and our resources to realize other initiatives. So for example, with the governments, we've worked with Southeast Asian governments so far, quite several to date, to realize initiatives. So for example, most recently, we worked with the South Korean government as an advisor to actually realize, design and implement their very first national level startup event. And that was quite interesting as well because the startup scene there is so different.
Right.
Yes.
How so?
In the sense that it was the first national level startup conference. So you'd expect the rate of startup development to be really quick in South Korea, but it's actually not as quick as we all imagine it to be. Just like Japan, for example. And I think it's also a cultural issue.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I was recently in Japan, and just conversations, they're not, I don't see that kind of energy that I see in this part of the world.
I think it's culture as well.
I think it's culture.
Yes. The Japanese, they have a very great respect for authority and conventions, and I think that affects as well how startups develop as well. We do see some, but not a lot.
And you also worked with Dubai.
Yes. So we work with the Dubai government Ministry of Education to basically design educational syllabus as well for business schools. And it's really about us leveraging what we have to try and help other ecosystems develop. And beyond the government as well, we've been quite active in community building. So we create physical and actual startup communities to really facilitate personal insight exchange through networking, for example. And these are as important as the platform itself.
Right. So in a way, are these are events that you've curated, and that's also an opportunity for sponsorships and another source of revenue for you guys?
Yes, certainly.
So you're not dependent on publishing. There are other ways of leveraging the revenue, because you're also quite active in online media as well.
Yes, that's right.
You find that that's been helpful in building the brand?
I think it's been helpful building the brand physically through these communities, because the brand is really about facilitating ecosystem growth, and you can't really have that without communities. Obviously, the online aspect is great, but much more than that, it's also about adding value through other ways that we can, and physically actually meeting someone and having an exchange of ideas and experience. That's as important as reading about it, if not more important, I think.
Right.
Now the challenge is physically these communities, they can only be so big, and online is where bridges where you can actually go beyond that. But certainly there is substantial value in that. In terms of revenue potential, it's certainly great. You could lead sponsors there, but at the same time, I think especially for events, one thing we found out in Asia is that there are lots of bad events that are really too commercially driven, where the sponsors have so much say that there isn't true value in the events themselves. And we try and set a very clear line where we don't become too commercially driven. Sometimes these sponsors, they have a say to the extent, for example, they have speakers from the sponsor side speaking, and they're selling classes and not really educating so much. So it is these things that we also have to be careful of. The same sort of integrity for content, we're also trying to set that out as well for these physical startup communities and events.
So speaking of, we talk about print magazines, but books, do you find, because you secured investments to launch a publishing arm, right? So what's this about? I guess it's going to be e-books as well as physical books. What's this publishing arm?
Yes, both. So the publishing arm is really this initiative by us where we want to really utilize the massive network of writers we have to date. We have about 650 people contributing on a monthly basis actively. And a lot of these people are from very diverse backgrounds, and some of them are really well established in terms of in their business and professional careers. And what they lack is, what they desire is they want to spread their and really kind of project their wisdom and impart the wisdom to other people, but they don't really have the means of doing so. So our platform was the means, but much more than that, in terms of publishing, it is really quite a difficult game in terms of getting published. And we want to really leverage this network and provide them an avenue where we can potentially publish their knowledge and their insights into a more codified form in terms of a book, physical and digital, and distribute. And the interesting thing is we've been speaking to other publishers, really big ones, and in the West. And what's interesting is that in a very similar way to the private equity investors that we work with, they sort of lack the sort of flow of opportunities to publish from writers that are based in Asia. So we sort of serve as that bridge to really connect these two together.
Right. Yeah. So it's you started out in 2012 with a printed publication, but of course your journey with entrepreneurship began earlier in Hong Kong and all that. So what have you discovered about yourself?
So this is a very interesting question, and I think the lessons I've really learned so far in my startup journey has really been about unlearning things. And it seems paradoxical, I know, but unlearning things that are second nature to me, beliefs that I once held. So for example, the first thing would be unlearning certainty. I think as a human and as an entrepreneur, we have this sort of excessive desire for certainty in life and everything, especially in business where it's further exacerbated by conventional business thought, where you have to plan everything out very precisely, chart out the waters in clear details. The reality is life and entrepreneurship especially is largely uncertain and inherently organic. So a lot of externalities, they do happen no matter how hard you try and plan it. And it's really about adaptation and also reaction. So I found out that it's a much more iterative and reactive process rather than planning throughout.
You can only plan so much, right? And you're talking about uncharted waters, you just don't see what's in the undercurrents.
Yes, and I think there's not enough focus on this aspect, this uncertainty. All the sort of content that we see and education that's being put out there about businesses, about all these strategies, strategic management, having clear plans, all these different strategies, but not enough about the aspect of uncertainty. I guess you could say that falls under risk management.
The VUCA world.
Yes. And the other thing as well is, and this is quite interesting, I think, would be to unlearn the idea that you should stick to what you know and stick to what you're good at. I tried to follow that advice, and then through my start journey, I found out that reality is the total opposite. If I would have stuck with that advice, I would still be a lawyer today in the legal profession, and we would still be in print. I think to try and only stick to what you know, rather than discover and be open to opportunities and different ideas and thoughts, you sort of narrow yourself and you silo yourself to basically very limited perspective, and that affects not only your life but I think also your business development. And then finally, I would say one of the biggest mistakes I've made, which seems really natural to me, was getting too involved in my business. And this is quite an interesting thing because a lot of people assume when you start a business, it's almost like giving birth. Of course, I know giving birth is much more intense. Yes, more painful, but you feel this natural inclination to really be part of it. For me, when I started, I wanted to do everything related to my startup's development, as well as really be involved in every facet of the business. But the issue with that is it's unsustainable. You would end up working, and what I did was I ended up working relentlessly for hours, 24/7, every day of the week. Psychologically and personally, it's unsustainable.
Right.
But also from a business standpoint, being the single engine that runs the startup itself, you basically have the entire startup, its life dependent more or less on you. And it's not something that is able to really survive on its own. So what I found out ultimately was, have my startup and business in general be run by three things. First thing would be leadership. Second thing would be people, and third thing would be systems. And leadership for me is really about setting a precise vision and also leading people where they have potentially the opportunity to be a key player in your organization and bring about their changes as well. And people is really the mindset to realize that it's not just about you. The people are as important, and the people themselves, you should see them as equal. Personally, we don't have a hierarchy with our company where certain people are bigger than others. It's about everyone being equal. That facilitates the sort of internal communication that is conducive to innovation within the company. And then finally, I would say as well, systems, really creating frameworks and structures where your business can operate one day maybe without you as well. And that's really been the three things that I've learned in terms of this experience.